Let me just get out my notes. Okay, now let's begin with what psychology is. Now, what is psychology? Psychology is actually a study of mental activity and behavior. Now, we all do this every day. Hence, we are psychologists, right? Intuitively, at least. Psychological scientists, however, are involved in study through research of mind, brain, and behavior. So, mind refers to mental activity responsible for memories, thoughts, and feelings resulting from biological processes within the brain. Examples include perceptual experiences like sights, smells, tastes, sound, and touches. Now, behavior describes a totality of observable actions exclusively in humans or occurring in all animals. Examples occurring exclusively in humans include debating philosophy, for example, or performing surgery. And the ones occurring in all humans are things like eating, drinking, mating, etc. Findings from psychological research are provocative. See? However, media report can be distorting or wrong. As a consumer of psychological science, skepticism is required to examine overblown reports of brand new things, new findings, or like groundbreaking research. When good evidence and sound reasoning do not seem to support them. Naturally thinking this way develops habits to systematically question and evaluate information um, using well-supported evidence. In other words, critical thinking. Critical thinking is a way of looking holes in evidence using logic and reasoning to see whether the information might be biased. People are often quick to question information that does not fit their beliefs. But as educated students and people, we must critically think by healthy questioning and keeping an open mind. Critical thinking is very useful. However, our thoughts are often biased in ways that make critical thinking challenging. There is this one scientific study that I found in the textbook where psychologists discover types of situations where common sense fails and biases influence people's judgment. This happens very commonly in our everyday lives. And one of the examples I saw in the textbook was where people used to believe eating too much sugar would make children hyperactive. Although it may not be true, most people believe so because they've seen it, experienced it, or have seen direct correlation. Although there can be several other factors affecting this situation. Our minds constantly analyze a lot of information we receive and try to make sense of that information. Most attempts generally result in relevant and correct conclusions. However, we sometimes get things wrong. Sometimes seeing and performing patterns we see and patterns that do not exist. Such information is interpreted due to biases in our brain. There are many types of biases, but here are some major biases that I'm going to list down and talk about in the next presentation in detail. So there's ignoring evidence, that's a confirmation bias. And there is failing to accurately judge source credibility. Who can you trust, right? And then there is misunderstanding or not using statistics. In other words, going with your gut. then seeing relationships that do not exist, making something out of nothing, using relative comparisons, accepting the fact explanations, taking mental shortcuts, keeping it simple, and failing to see our own inadequacies. Yeah, so that would conclude my presentation. Thank you for listening. And do we have any questions?
Thank you, Saadath. I typed 2 questions for you. Also,
How nice.
thank you for taking the time to present to us chapter.
No problem. Now, let me read the questions out. Oh, we have a nice haircut. Okay, nice. Um, could mental activity be considered a form of behavior? Some say yes, some say no. No, I can't read the full thing. Okay. Yeah. Under what conditions would you call mental activity a behavior? Okay, so could mental activity be considered a form of behavior? Mental activity could not be considered a behavior because mental activity goes on in the head and it's less observable, whereas behavior are more observable actions and characteristics of a human being. Does that answer your question?
So some people in the history of psychology have considered mental activity a behavior. They've counted that as another form of behavior. So maybe if you think like a computer and you think like, if you just think everything that is output, everything that is processing is behavior, then maybe you could consider, if you consider the human a computer, then you would say all of the mental activity, which is processing, output, behavior.
I guess. But I guess mental activity, it it's less observable from what I've heard from the textbook, and it's responsible for memories, thoughts, and like biological processes within the brain. So it happens within the brain,
Well,
right?
well, I'm kind of asking you a philosophical question where it's like, we can define behavior as we choose, right? It's kind of subjective. You define it how you want. And so I'm basically saying like, what if we tried another definition? That's all.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for your answer. What was your favorite thing you learned from the chapter?
The favorite thing I learned from the chapter was actually I didn't take notes of that part, but it was the example of how, because I was so into it, I didn't take notes. So it's the example of the sugar thing being related to kids with hyperactivity, right? I found that how people could jump into conclusions so easily, whereas if you look at the bigger picture, there is like no patterns or anything.
Yeah.
It's just it's a bias. It's our own personal bias that help us form this sort of conclusion. And sometimes we might be wrong. So when we might be wrong in such stuff, that's when we have to use critical thinking. So yeah, I kind of find that interesting.
That is interesting.
Yeah, I should critical think more.
Yeah. I think throughout the chapter, throughout the textbook, you're going to find a lot of examples where what the science of psychology has found is very different from what people would assume to be true, right?
It's also more interesting how there are more astrologists than astronomers. I've read that in the textbook, and I was like, that actually might be true. People tend to be more tend to find patterns out of nothing rather than actually find patterns.
Yeah, it's also a lot easier to become an astrologist than an astronomer, right? Because you just read some.
There's no degree with an astrologist.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, and then Emily asked, she said, "Good job." Question.
Thank you.
What is a way that you see or have noticed biases in your own life and in those around you?
Okay. Well, most common biases I hear is my dad telling me that having long hair would people perceive having long hair would be closely related to homelessness.
Mm.
And I personally, maybe, maybe he might be wrong, he might be wrong, he might be right, but I personally think that he's a bit biased
Mm-hmm.
just because I don't think he had as much exposure as I did in looking at people outside India. Because in India, yes, it would make more sense that long hair associates with homelessness. But people outside, like here, people have long hair, like they're not homeless. So I feel like that is a bias considering of how he sees the world and what he's usually seen. Yeah. Simple example, but I feel like that's
Yeah, that's a bias. Yeah,
Mhm.
and it's a bias that's like it's a good bias to make maybe in certain situations, like you said, maybe in certain parts of India, but outside of that, maybe it's not always correct all the time.
Mhm.
But what's interesting about bias is that you need it. You need it to process the like billions of bits, the trillions of bits of information. Like you deal with a lot of information every day, and so you need bias to manage it. But like sometimes
But what if you can critically think everything? Won't you be more accurate that way?
like there's no such thing as thought or information processing without bias. Like there's necessarily bias.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, like everything, there's bias everywhere, right? You, for example, like you don't take information and like you carry with you your learning history in assessing any bits of information, right? So
Mhm.
that's more bias. Yeah. So thank you, Saadath.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Sebastian, are you ready?
Hello?
I'm looking forward to yours. Yours should be very interesting.
All right. Well, thank you. Well, I have to admit, so my slides are underdeveloped, but it was a really good read.
It's better
Um,
than mine. I have no slides.